Tonight, walk with me into the heart of Dazar'alor, where gold shines like a promise and every echo remembers war. We will begin at the docks of Zandalar, climb through the Grand Bazaar and the Zocalo, and step into the pyramid's shadow where faith, pride, and desperation tighten like a noose. You will hear of a living weapon named Grong, of vaults where opulence guards itself like a beast, and of Loa whose blessings feel like storms waiting behind stone. We will pass the Hall of Chroniclers, where an empire rehearses its own eternity, and then reach the Golden Throne, where a king borrows power from death and calls it salvation. And when the sea returns to claim the night, you will feel the blockade closing, the wind turning sharp, and the moment my fear becomes ice. I did not come here for glory. I came because duty demanded an answer, and because the cost of hesitation is written in names I cannot forget. So take your time, keep your steps slow, and let the waves and the footsteps carry you. You begin at the port of Zandalar, where ropes creak and gulls drift over the water as if they are counting ships. I speak softly here, because harbors are always listening, and they keep the secrets of every fleet that ever dared to anchor. I have stood on docks like this before, on nights when the tide sounded gentle, and the next sunrise never belonged to the same world. If you look out across the bay, you can almost imagine the great sea as a sheet of dark glass, unbroken and innocent. I used to believe the ocean forgave everything because it swallowed blood, smoke, and sorrow without complaint. Then I learned the sea does not forgive, and it does not forget, and it simply carries what we throw into it until it reaches someone else. Walk along the planks with your measured steps, because a slow pace is the only honest pace for a story like this. The Zandalari built this port with pride, and it shows in every polished stone and every towering statue that watches the shoreline. If you pause near stacked crates and hanging nets, you can see the small rituals that hold a port together. A worker ties a knot the way their father taught them, not thinking of war, only thinking of whether the knot will hold. A lantern sways gently, and its light trembles on the water like a quiet promise. A merchant counts coins, and the sound is soft, almost comforting, as if the world can still be measured and understood. Ordinary life is not loud, and that is why it is so easy to break. When leaders speak of victory, they rarely mention the lanterns. They rarely mention the knots, but these are what people actually lose. And as I watch the docks, I cannot stop myself from thinking that the first duty of power should be to protect the ordinary. If power cannot protect the ordinary, then what is it for? They wanted the world to understand that their empire did not merely survive, but endured, and that endurance can look like arrogance when you are staring at it from below. I know that feeling, because I once built walls out of certainty, and I called them safety. The air here tastes of salt and distant incense drifting down from the pyramid city above, as though even the wind must climb stairs to reach its destination. You can hear drums sometimes, far away, and they sound like a heartbeat echoing through gold. This place is the threshold of a capital, and thresholds always demand something from the ones who cross them. Keep walking toward the ramps that lead inland, and let the camera linger on the ships, because ships are promises made of wood. I was raised among sailors, and I have heard promises creak in storms, and I have watched them snap when fear turns hands to shaking. The war that brought me here was not the first war I lived through, and it will not be the last war this world invents, but it was a war that turned every coastline into a possible wound, and every harbor into a possible battlefield. The Zandalari were not the original architects of that war, and yet they became one of its most dangerous turning points. Their golden fleet was not just a collection of vessels, and it was an idea made physical. An empire's reach stretched across the horizon. When an empire can send its ships anywhere, it can also send its certainty, its threats, and its bargains. There are times when the only way to stop a tide is to break the thing that moves it. So I came, not as a curious traveler, and not as a diplomat, and not even as a hero who believes her own songs. I came as a woman who has buried too many friends, and who is tired of pretending that patience will protect the innocent. If you tilt your view upward, you can see the pyramid of Dazar'alor rising above the city like a golden mountain carved into commandments. It is beautiful in a way that feels untouchable, as though beauty itself could be a weapon. The streets climbing toward that pyramid were designed to humble visitors and to remind them that they walk in the shadow of kings. I have walked in the shadow of kings before, and I know how heavy it can feel when the shadow is also a warning. You pass dock workers, guards, merchants, and passing silhouettes that look small beneath the stonework, and you realize how many lives can exist inside a single city. Those lives do not deserve to be reduced to a strategic objective or a footnote in a war report. Yet wars do that, and wars are very good at turning people into numbers, because numbers do not cry. As you approach the Grand Bazaar, the air becomes warmer with cooking smoke, and sweeter with fruit and spice, and noisier with bargaining voices. That noise is comforting, because it proves the city is alive, and it is terrifying, because it proves what can be lost. This is where the story begins, and it is also where it ends, because every beginning carries its ending inside it like a seed. Keep walking, and let the bazaar's noise rise around you, because the next steps climb toward the Zocalo, where faith and war meet under open sky. The Grand Bazaar is a soft chaos of voices, fabric, food smoke, and glittering trinkets that catch the light like small captive stars. Walk slowly along the edges so the viewer can taste the atmosphere without feeling rushed. There is a tenderness in ordinary commerce because it is people choosing tomorrow without realizing it. I remember a different harbor, a different market, and a different night when I heard laughter and thought it meant safety. I learned that laughter can vanish in a single breath, and then you are left with only the echo. The softness of a normal evening is what makes violence so unbearable, because normal life is the first thing war steals. Let the camera linger on fruit stalls and hanging lanterns, because these are the details history forgets when it starts listing victories. The city's roads rise gently here, and the climb feels ceremonial, as though the streets themselves are part of a ritual. As you leave the bazaar, the smell of spice thins, replaced by cool air and the faint perfume of flowers arranged for offerings. Zuldazar is built to guide the eye upward, and it is difficult not to obey that instruction. I have always been suspicious of places that demand your gaze, because they often demand your loyalty next. The path narrows, then widens, and the shifting space feels like the city is breathing around you. The Zocalo opens ahead like a broad breath of space, and the sky above it feels suddenly close, as if the clouds are leaning in to listen. In that open plaza, stone meets sunlight, and banners snap in the wind with the impatience of a world that refuses to rest. Walk the perimeter first, because wide spaces make you feel small, and feeling small is not always weakness. Sometimes feeling small is honesty, and honesty can keep you from making foolish promises to yourself. This is where the first defense becomes more than soldiers and becomes meaning. In my war, I met a Zandalari warrior who drew strength from the light, and that alone should tell you how complicated this world truly is. The light is not a banner exclusive to any one people, and it is not a weapon that chooses sides the way soldiers do. When a champion of the light stands in defense of her home, she does not see herself as a villain. She sees herself as a shield, and shields do not apologize for protecting what is behind them. I want the listener to understand that the first resistance in this story is not evil, but conviction wearing armor. Conviction can be kind, and conviction can be cruel, and the difference is often invisible until it is too late. You move from the Zocalo toward the terraced paths that lead into inner courtyards, and the city begins to feel narrower again. Narrow paths do something to the mind, because they make the future feel like a corridor. There are moments in every war when the world narrows to a single door, and the decision becomes whether you open it or turn away. I opened it, and I cannot unopen it. And that is why I tell this story as softly as I can. Walk into the pyramid's shadow, because the light changes suddenly there, and that change feels like entering a thought you cannot stop. Now we climb toward the Great Seal, where the city becomes a fortress and the story becomes heavier. The Great Seal is not merely a room, and it is an idea shaped into stone, because it is where decisions become orders. As you enter, let your steps slow down further, because power always feels quiet up close. Power does not need to shout, because it assumes you will listen anyway. Here, the architecture feels heavier, and even the air seems to carry responsibility like a cloak. I have stood in war rooms where maps were spread like altar cloths and lives were moved like markers. Every time I did, I promised myself I would never forget that each marker had a name. The war tested that promise because the war is very good at turning names into noise. Walk along the edges near pillars and balconies and let the viewer absorb the scale. Scale is important because it reminds you how small one person is inside an empire, and yet a single person can still decide to set the empire on fire. I came with planning, allies, machines, and resolve sharp enough to cut the night in half, but resolve is not a shield against regret, and it never has been. Somewhere beyond these halls, a creature built for war waited, and its tragedy was that it did not choose to be what it was. Grong was strength given a heartbeat, and then pointed toward destruction, as if that were a purpose worthy of a living thing. When I speak of him, I do not want to sound triumphant, because triumph over a living weapon is not the same as triumph over evil. A living weapon is often just a victim shaped into a tool. The tragedy of war is that it creates monsters and then congratulates itself for slaying them. I have done that in my life, and it is a stain that does not wash out. Past the memory of brute force, the halls become more opulent, as though the pyramid wants to remind you what it is protecting. Gold trims the edges of everything, and polished surfaces catch torchlight like captive stars. Opulence is not simply wealth, and it is a language, and the Zandalari speak it fluently. In vault-like spaces where treasures rest, silence grows thick, because riches do not like to be disturbed. That silence is almost soothing, and that is what makes it dangerous. When silence feels soothing, It can persuade you that nothing truly terrible will happen here, but terrible things happen in beautiful rooms all the time, and beauty does not prevent cruelty. As you continue forward, the air changes again, and it becomes scented with ritual. Incense and sacred oils cling to the stone because religion leaves marks that even time respects. The Zandalari are not a people who separate politics from faith, because for them the Loa are not distant myths. They are present, hungry, watchful, and close enough to feel like weather. That closeness changes the way a city defends itself, because it can call upon more than soldiers. It can call upon meaning, and meaning is one of the hardest things to fight. We keep walking, and the story turns towards sanctums where devotion breathes in the dark. You enter the sanctum approaches now, and the architecture shifts from imperial gold to something older and more primal. It feels like walking into a story that began before any of us were born, and that will continue after we are dust. The air is cooler, and it carries a faint scent of rain even if the sky is clear, because faith often feels like weather. Walk steadily as though you are approaching an altar, because this part should feel like a slow procession. A procession has dignity, and dignity helps the listener relax even when the subject is conflict. The Loa are not gentle concepts, and they are not polite, and they are not safe. They are power-shaped like instinct, and they take what they are owed. To the Zandalari, the Loa are part of everyday life, as intimate as breath. To an outsider, that intimacy can feel like standing too close to a storm. When a city believes its gods are in the room, the city stands differently. It stands with a kind of certainty that does not require permission. When I think of the conclave of the chosen, I think less of enemies and more of guardians bound by sacred oaths. Guardians are frightening because they do not fight for themselves alone. They fight for a promise, and promises can make people fearless. The champions empowered by Loa did not feel like ordinary soldiers. They felt like living echoes of ancient bargains. There is a particular kind of sorrow in facing someone who believes the gods themselves stand behind them. If you defeat them, you do not only defeat a body, you also wound a belief, and beliefs do not heal quickly. Meaning is a battlefield too, and people spill blood for it with the same devotion they spill blood for land. I do not mock their faith, because mocking faith is a shortcut to arrogance. I have had enough arrogance for one lifetime. If you pause near any water or carved basin, let the camera rest there, because water in a temple feels sacred. Water reflects the world as it is, and as it might be, and I often wonder what my reflection looked like that night. I wonder whether I looked like a protector, or whether I looked like a storm searching for a shore to break. As you move on, the gold returns, brighter and more commanding. The pyramid's heart is above you, and you can feel the weight of leadership pressing down like altitude. This is where a king sits, and kings do not stay kings by being passive. In the hush before the next halls, every step sounds louder, and inevitability begins to sound like a rhythm. Now we pass into a calmer corridor of preserved stories, because the throne is close, and the Empire wants you to remember what it believes it is. We leave the Loa sanctums behind with the scent of incense still clinging to the stone, and we step into corridors that feel quieter, older, and more deliberate. The gold returns in thin lines along the walls, but here it is, less decorative, and more like a seal meant to keep something contained. Your footsteps change again, softer, because the floor is smoother, and the sound carries farther than it should. This part of Dazar'alor is not built to impress visitors. It is built to preserve memory, and memory always demands silence. The air feels cooler in a way that suggests the sunlight has been politely turned away, as if this place prefers lamplight and reverence. Even the torches burn differently here, steadier, quieter, like disciplined servants who were trained not to disturb the past. You can almost hear the faint hush of parchment that is not present, because the idea of a library can become so strong that the mind fills it in. As you walk, you pass carvings that show ships with tall sails, armies in tight formation, and kings standing beneath the watchful eyes of towering Loa. I speak carefully because history has sharp edges, and it can cut the tongue that speaks it too loudly. There is a difference between a city that lives in the present and a city that insists the past is still in the room. Zandalar insists. You can feel it in the way the air seems heavier near the walls, as though words have been spoken here so many times that the stone learned to hold them. In some alcoves, the carvings are polished by countless hands, the way a talisman is polished by anxious fingers seeking comfort. Here, the Empire does not merely remember, it rehearses, and rehearsal makes memory feel like law. A people who have endured for ages learn to treat their endurance like proof that they are meant to endure again. Proof is a dangerous thing because it can turn into entitlement without anyone noticing the moment it changed. The corridor widens into a space that feels like a library without open shelves, because the true books here are carved into pillars and sealed behind doors. The Hall of Chroniclers is a place that tells the Empire what it is supposed to believe about itself. Every empire has a room like this, even if it does not call it a hall. In Kul Tiras, we have our own stories, polished and repeated until they sound like truth. We tell ourselves we are the sea's children, and that storms are our birthright, and that sacrifice is the natural language of duty. I used to be comforted by those stories. Now I understand stories can be cages because they teach you which feelings are permitted and which doubts are forbidden. When your entire life is framed as a duty, you begin to believe you do not have the right to be tired. When your entire nation is framed as chosen, you begin to believe you do not have the right to lose. This hall is built from that belief, and belief like this does not bend easily. I have tried to bend beliefs before, with speeches and diplomacy and pleas, and I learned that beliefs do not move until pain moves them. That is one of war's most unforgivable truths, because it means war becomes the teacher when the world refuses gentler lessons. Kul Tiras and Zandalar are both shaped by water, even if one hides it behind gold and one wears it openly like a cloak. Both learn to measure the world by tides, by storms, by what returns and what never comes back. Both learned to trust ships the way some people trust prayers, and both learned that the sea rewards discipline until the day it decides discipline is not enough. I understand their pride, because I was raised in pride too. The difference is that pride becomes gentler when it is tempered by loss, and sharper when it is protected from consequence. Here in these halls, I can feel how Zandalar's stories tried to protect it from consequence by calling it eternal. Eternal is a beautiful word. Eternal is also a trap, because it teaches you to gamble as if you will always have time to recover. This is where I let the raid's heartbeat slow, because the listener needs a calm place to breathe before the throne room's weight returns. So I tell you about the king, not as an enemy in a single night, but as a man shaped by centuries that never stopped demanding his certainty. Rastakhan was crowned in a world where Zandalar already believed itself eternal, and he inherited that belief like a crown made of stone. A crown made of stone does not bend. It presses down until the neck aches, and the ache becomes normal. And then the ache becomes identity. He ruled long enough that people stopped imagining any other face on the throne, and that kind of time can make a ruler feel fused to his seat. I have seen leaders become fused to their titles, and once they do, they begin to confuse the throne with the world itself. A long reign teaches you a dangerous lesson. It teaches you that time will always give you one more day to solve your problems. Then, suddenly, time does not. The blood trolls, the rot of corruption, the pressure of old enemies in the swamps and jungles, all of it pressed from within, and the war pressed from without, because the Horde and the Alliance turned every ally into a weapon, and every promise into a threat. If you have been surrounded long enough, you start to believe you are allowed to do anything to survive. That belief does not begin as evil. It begins as fear, and fear is the most persuasive counselor a ruler will ever have. And somewhere in that fear, Bonsamdi's name begins to sound less like a warning and more like an answer. Before we leave this hall, I want to place one truth in your hands, like a warm stone. No one reaches for death's power because they are comfortable. They reach for it because they are terrified of losing what they think they are meant to keep. And when they reach, death always reaches back. Now we keep walking, steadily and without hurry, because the throne room is close enough to feel, and inevitability is a sound you can hear if you listen closely. We leave the preserved stories behind, and we step toward the living decision. The corridor narrows slightly, like the pyramid is guiding you into a single outcome. The air becomes stiller, and the silence starts to feel intentional, like an audience holding its breath. Even the gold looks different now, less celebratory and more severe, as though it already knows what it will witness. And with each step, the past falls quiet behind us, not because it is gone, but because it is waiting to judge what comes next. When you step through the raid's threshold, the world does not change with a dramatic flash, and it changes with a hush. The noise of the living city dulls as if a blanket has been laid over it, and what remains is the sound of your own footsteps insisting on being heard. I have walked into places like this before, where a doorway is not merely stone, but a decision made physical. Inside, the air feels cooler, and it tastes faintly of old incense and metal, the way a blade smells after it has been handled too long. The light is different here, not because the torches are brighter, but because they seem more controlled, as though even flame is expected to behave in the presence of power. Keep your pace slow, because this is the kind of corridor that turns haste into a betrayal of atmosphere. Your footsteps create a steady rhythm, and that rhythm becomes the heart of the scene, calmer than drums, calmer than war. I speak softly because the walls here carry memory, and loud voices feel like an insult to memory. This is still Dazar'alor, and yet it is also a version of Dazar'alor, pinned to a single night, preserved like an insect in amber. Somewhere outside these walls, the city continues to live and breathe, but in here, time holds still long enough to be judged. I have learned that battles do not truly end when they end. They continue as echoes, and this is where the echo lives. Walk forward into the first interior stretch, where banners hang in patient rows, and the gold trim catches torchlight without smiling. Gold can be celebratory, but here it feels severe, like a crown that refuses to lighten its weight. The architecture does not welcome you, and it does not threaten you either. It simply assumes you should know your place. That assumption is the voice of an empire, and empires speak that way even when they are afraid. The corridors curve gently, and the curve is calming, the way a river is calming when you forget it can flood. If you keep your camera near the walls for a moment, you can show the carvings and the repeating motifs: birds, beasts, spearheads, sunbursts, symbols that say again and again that Zandalar is meant to endure. I understand why a people would cling to that claim. Endurance is a comfort when the world has tried to erase you. But endurance can also turn into pride so hard it becomes brittle, and brittle things break in unexpected ways. The stillness here is almost sleep-friendly, because it's a stillness that asks nothing from you except attention. Let the listener settle into that stillness, because the story's emotional weight lands better when the mind is calm enough to hold it. As you move deeper, you pass spaces that feel like remembered stages, as though the rooms themselves are quietly replaying what happened. I do not describe every clash again, because you have already walked the road that led here in my words. Instead, I let the rooms feel like portraits you pass in a gallery, each one a moment of the night preserved behind invisible glass. There was a defender who carried the light like a shield, and the room that held her conviction still feels bright in a stern way, as if the air remembers the shape of prayer. There was a pair of masters whose dance of discipline and flame made war look like choreography, and the corridor near their space feels narrow, as if it wants you to keep your shoulders drawn in. There was a beast shaped into a weapon, and the stone near that place feels colder, as if the walls are ashamed of what they witnessed. There was a vault of wealth so quiet it could have lulled you into forgetting that violence was occurring at all, and that quiet still clings here like dust on polished metal. There was a sanctum where devotion felt like weather, where gods were not stories but presences, and the air in those passages still feels charged, like thunder waiting behind curtains. In a raid, these are called encounters, and in a war, they become chapters in someone else's grief. I have learned that every room you pass through in conflict becomes a room you carry inside you afterward. Some people carry their rooms like trophies. Some carry them like wounds. I carry them like stones in my pockets, and each stone has a name I do not always speak aloud. This is where I let my voice become more intimate, because the walk inside the instance is not only about where you are going, it is also about what you are becoming, step by step, without noticing. When I planned this assault, I told myself I was choosing the lesser harm, and I believed that belief because I needed it to function. But inside halls like these, where echoes have time to form, the mind begins to ask the questions it avoided outside. Was this the only path? Was this the cleanest path? Was this the path I chose because it was right, or because it was possible? Possible is not the same as right, and war loves to pretend they are twins. As you keep walking upward through the gentle rise of the corridors, let the camera show the way the ceilings lift, how the space opens and narrows like breath. The pyramid feels alive in that way, like a creature that can sense you moving through its ribs. I think of Kultiras then, of our own stone halls and naval traditions, and the strange closeness between a city built on ships and a city built on gold. Both believe they deserve to endure. Both learned to pray for endurance with clenched fists, and both will pay for that prayer when the world decides it wants a different answer. The throne is ahead, and you can feel it, not as a location, but as pressure. The way you feel a storm coming before you see clouds. So we continue, not rushing, because rushing would be a lie. A climax like this always arrives at its own pace. Let the footsteps carry us, one calm step at a time, toward the room where a king will try to borrow power from death and call it salvation. The throne room does not feel like a room, and it feels like a verdict. Gold surrounds you, and banners hang like captured sunlight, and the air tastes of power. When you step into that space, you understand that this is where the Zandalari tell themselves who they are. They tell themselves they are eternal, and that their kings are chosen, and that history is a staircase leading only upward. History is not a staircase. History is a tide, and tides go out. The stone beneath your feet is worn smoother where generations approached the throne, careful with their breath and careful with their words. This is not only a seat of rule, it is a stage where fear and pride learn to speak politely to each other. Walk slowly along the outer edge, because the center of the room is too heavy to rush toward. In places like this, haste feels like disrespect, and disrespect invites the room itself to turn against you. Rastakhan sat at the heart of that belief, and he carried it the way an old sailor carries scars. He was not merely stubborn, and he was not merely proud. He was responsible for a people who expected him to be a pillar. When pillars crack, entire buildings tremble. I know what it is to be treated like a pillar, because people sometimes look at me and see salvation instead of a person. Salvation is a terrible burden, because it invites despair whenever you fail. A king who has ruled too long learns to fear not death, but irrelevance, because irrelevance feels like a kind of erasure. And for an empire that calls itself ancient, erasure is the one humiliation it cannot tolerate. I could feel that in him, even through armor, even through anger, even through the hardened calm of a monarch who learned never to show trembling hands. He was a man who had been obeyed for so many years that contradictions sounded like betrayal, and yet, beneath that authority, there was a fatigue that no crown can hide forever. He stood not only for himself, but for an entire city built upward like a prayer carved into gold. Rastakhan's desperation was not theatrical, and it was real, because his empire was threatened and his fleet was burning. When a ruler feels the ground shaking beneath his throne, he reaches for anything that promises stability. Sometimes what he reaches for is a friend. Sometimes what he reaches for is a god. And sometimes what he reaches for is death itself, wearing a smile and offering a contract. Bwansamdi is not merciful in the way the innocent hope for mercy. He is a Loa of graves and bargains always require a payment you wish you did not owe. His presence is the feeling of cold coins on the eyelids, the quiet certainty that every heartbeat has an owner waiting to collect. Rastakhan's bargain was the sound of a door closing behind him. Once you step through that door, you may still walk forward, but you cannot pretend you have not crossed a boundary. I have crossed boundaries too, and I recognize the look in someone's eyes when they do something irreversible. It is not madness, it is resignation dressed as resolve. After the bargain is spoken, there is often a second of quiet that feels too large for the body to hold. It is the quiet of a ship that has snapped a rope and is pretending it has not yet drifted. In that quiet, I can almost hear the Empire's stories shifting their weight, adjusting to a new truth they never wanted to learn. A bargain with death does not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrives like a signature drying on paper. It arrives like a lantern dimming in a room where no one admits they are afraid. I have watched people make irreversible choices before, and the most frightening part is how ordinary they look while doing it. No one's eyes glow with villainy. No music announces the crossing. A person simply decides. And then the world rearranges itself around that decision. In that room, I felt a pressure behind my ribs that had nothing to do with magic. It was the pressure of knowing that whatever happened next would not end in agreement. It would end in inheritance. Someone would inherit grief. Someone would inherit fury. Someone would inherit a story sharp enough to cut future generations. And I realized, with a calm that frightened me, that I was helping to forge that inheritance. This is the hidden cost of leadership. You do not only act in the present, you plant emotions in the future, and you may never live long enough to see what grows. So even as I held myself steady, even as I spoke with command in my voice, a quieter part of me listened to the room and knew the truth. This victory, if it could be called that, would not close the war. It would simply teach the war a new way to speak. The cruel trick of desperate power is that it feels like hope while it is tightening a chain. And the chain only becomes obvious when you try to set it down and find it has already fused to your wrist. As you listen to me speak, let the room's silence do half the work, because silence makes the words sink. A bargain with death does not need dramatic music. It needs only the listener's quiet understanding that there is no clean way out. I think about his daughter, and the grief that would harden into something sharper than any blade. Grief does that, because grief is love that has nowhere to go. When love has nowhere to go, it becomes fury, and fury finds targets. If you slowly look across the banners in gold, remember this is what fury inherits. Empires pass down not only wealth, but wounds. When the king fell, it was not only a victory, and it was a fracture in the world's story. Silence after battle is not peaceful. Silence after battle is the world trying to decide whether it can keep spinning. I could feel the room's meaning shift, like a ship changing direction under sudden wind. I could feel history turning its face toward the next chapter, the way the sea turns toward the shore it intends to strike. And in that shift, I knew we were not ending a war. We were feeding it. This is the bitter truth leaders swallow. Some victories do not end violence. They simply decide who carries the violence next. The crown did not vanish when the king fell. It simply moved from certainty into grief, and grief is a fierce ruler. Walk toward the exit route that leads back out of the pyramid, because the story must move now from conquest to consequence. Consequence always arrives faster than people expect. Outside these golden walls, the city still breathes, and grief begins its slow work. And on the sea beyond the harbor, ships gather, and the war shifts like a storm changing direction. We withdraw, because withdrawal is sometimes the only way to keep the living alive. As you begin the walk back down, let the viewer feel the descent, because descending after a climax feels like waking from a dream. You do not wake all at once. You wake in pieces. You wake when the adrenaline fades and the mind starts counting the names it avoided counting during the fight. You wake when you hear your own footsteps again and realize your body is still here, and that survival itself will demand an explanation. And as we move down these corridors, the gold above us feels less like triumph and more like weight, because the throne room's echo follows even when the door is behind you. When you leave the throne room's weight behind, it does not stay behind you like a closed door. It follows, lightly at first, then heavier, like wet cloth clinging to your shoulders. Walk at a measured pace through the descending corridors, because descent after a climax is the moment when truth tries to settle in. The gold feels dimmer now, not because the torches have changed, but because you have changed. You begin to notice how silence is never truly silent in a fortress. Silence is made of distant footsteps, low voices behind stone, the faint rattle of armor somewhere you cannot see. Silence is made of a city holding its breath. I speak in a softer register here because softness makes room for reflection, and reflection is what turns a raid into a story. As you move, the air picks up a hint of salt again, faint at first, like a memory returning. Salt is home to me, even when it is carried on enemy wind. And as the scent strengthens, I know we are being pulled toward the sea, toward ships, toward the kind of battlefield that speaks my language too fluently. The architecture begins to change in subtle ways. There are more open stretches where wind can slip through, and the sound becomes less muffled, as if the pyramid is finally letting the outside back in. Your footsteps still strike stone, but you can imagine wood nearby, the suggestion of docks and rigging not far beyond the walls. In my mind, I hear ropes creak long before I see them, because ropes have a voice when the sea is restless. If you angle your camera toward any openings, any views, any distant glimpses of sky, let them linger. A glimpse of sky feels like relief after the pressure of the throne room. But relief in war is always temporary, and temporary things are the most dangerous to fall in love with. As we move forward, the air grows cooler and more alive, and the listener can feel the approach of open water even without seeing it yet. This is the gift of ambience, because ambience tells the body what the eyes have not confirmed. It tells the body, quietly, to prepare. Now, let the narration become more like a lullaby of danger, soft words describing hard things. A blockade is not merely ships in the water. A blockade is the sea being told it must behave. It is the horizon being narrowed by cannons and discipline. It is the feeling of realizing that for all the ocean's width, there are moments when it offers no safe path at all. When ships converge, the sound changes first. The wind has less room to sing. The waves slap differently against hulls because the water is disturbed by so much mass. Even the gulls become fewer, as if they sense that the sea's mood has turned. In a blockade, the ocean stops feeling like a mother and begins feeling like a witness. A witness watches without mercy. A witness does not care who is right. A witness simply records what happens and carries it forward in memory. I have lived with the ocean as witness my entire life, and I have both feared and relied on that indifference, because indifference is honest. It does not pretend to be kind. When you have lived with ships long enough, you learn a kind of sailor's math that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with distance. A safe sea is not measured by how wide it is, but by how many choices it offers when something goes wrong. A calm horizon can still be a trap if the wind turns against you, if the currents disagree, if the enemy chooses the one angle you forgot to respect. That is what a blockade does. It takes a world that looks open and teaches you that openness can be an illusion. As you keep walking, imagine the sound of masts shifting as ships adjust their positions, subtle movements that look harmless until you realize each movement is closing a door. The first door closes quietly. A ship turns, a sail catches, the water churns, and the route that was there a moment ago is suddenly covered by steel and intention. The second door closes with the sound of cannons being prepared, not fired, just prepared, because preparation is often more frightening than impact. Prepared cannons are a promise of violence that the mind cannot ignore, and the mind starts inventing endings before anything has happened. I have seen sailors grow pale at the sound of loading chains, because chains mean the fight will not be quick, and quick fights are the merciful kind. In a blockade, even the waves seem to change their voice. They slap against hulls in short, impatient bursts, as if the sea itself is annoyed by how crowded it has become. Crowded water feels wrong, because water is meant to move, and blockades are attempts to make movement obey. You can feel that wrongness in your bones when you stand on a deck, and the air smells of tar, salt, and smoke that hasn't fully arrived yet. Smoke that hasn't arrived is a particular kind of fear. It is the future making itself known through scent alone. As we approach the harbor spaces, I remember how quickly courage can become routine when you are forced to practice it too often. Sailors learn to do brave things the way they learn to tie knots, because if bravery required inspiration every time, no ship would ever leave port. But there is a limit to routine courage. There is a point where the body is moving correctly, and the spirit is lagging behind, exhausted, trying to catch up. I felt that exhaustion that night, not only in others, but in myself. Because leadership demands you appear steady, even when you are splintering inside. I could not afford to look like I doubted the sea, because everyone aboard was already doubting it. So I spoke with certainty, and I held my shoulders like a mast, and I tried to become something sturdy enough for others to lean on. That is another kind of sailor's math. You measure how many people are watching you, and you decide how much of your fear you are allowed to show. And when the answer is none, fear doesn't vanish. It simply changes shape. It becomes control. It becomes the urge to freeze the world into stillness, because stillness feels safer than motion. That is when I knew the storm in me was rising again, not as anger, but as a desperate kind of protection that doesn't always know where to stop. This is the moment where my story and the sea's story overlap so perfectly that you can barely tell them apart. I am at my most dangerous when I am afraid, because fear makes me reach for control the way a drowning person reaches for air. And on that night, as the chase tightened and the routes narrowed, I could feel the old instincts rising. Protect, contain, freeze the world long enough for the people behind you to breathe. If you want the viewer to feel that instinct, keep walking steadily while I speak, because steadiness on screen makes the confession feel deeper. The calm walk contrasts with the storm in the words, and that contrast is soothing even when the subject is severe. Power builds like weather, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly you realize the air has changed and you are already inside the storm. That is how it felt for me. Not like a decision to become a monster. Like a decision to become a wall, and then realizing walls can crush as easily as they protect. So we keep walking toward the harborside spaces, letting the sound of water grow louder, letting the listener settle into the rhythm of waves. And then, without rushing, we allow the story to turn to the final truth. The truth that the war did not only test my strength, it tested whether I could remain human while carrying it. We move downward now through the same corridors that once felt like a challenge, and that now feel like an escape route. Your footsteps should remain steady, because steadiness is how people survive panic. Panic makes bad decisions, and bad decisions become funerals. As the pyramid's interior gives way to outer pathways, you feel wind again, and wind feels like freedom, even when it carries danger. The city's sounds return, faint and scattered, and you remember that entire lives continue even while battles reshape empires. Somewhere below, vendors will still call out prices, and children will still laugh, and someone will still light a lamp and believe the night will be ordinary. That belief is fragile, and it is precious, and it is what war keeps breaking. Walk along the terraces so the viewer can see the city open beneath you, because perspective helps the mind breathe. From above, Zuldazar looks like a story carved into the landscape, and stories always look cleaner from a distance. In the retreat, machines and cleverness mattered as much as swords. Mekatork, brilliant and stubborn, proved that leadership can come in a small body with an enormous will. His mind was a forge, and he hammered ideas into weapons because he believed ideas could end suffering. Ideas can end suffering, but they can also create new suffering when they are used without restraint. I watched his courage in that chaos, and I remember thinking that courage and recklessness sometimes share the same heartbeat. A leader cannot afford to be only brilliant. A leader must also be careful, and careful is difficult when the world is on fire. Then the sea became its own battlefield, and the Stormwall blockade felt less like a duel and more like a trap closing. Ships do not have many places to run when the enemy closes in. The ocean is wide, but the paths through it can become narrow when guns are pointed at your hull. There is a sound a ship makes when it turns hard against the wind, and it is almost a moan, like wood resenting the strain. That night, the sea was not a comforting mother. The sea was a cold witness, and a witness does not intervene. A witness only remembers, and memory is sometimes the cruelest record. As you reach the port of Zandalar again, the story's circle tightens because beginnings and endings share a shoreline. If you walk near the edge of the docks, let the camera look out over the bay as if searching for what you know you cannot find. Loss makes you search for absence because the mind refuses to accept emptiness. The air tastes sharper here, as though smoke has left a flavor that salt cannot wash away. Even when the water looks calm, you can imagine how quickly calm becomes chaos when cannons begin speaking. In that retreat, I was not only trying to survive. I was trying to ensure my people survived, because responsibility does not end when you turn around. Responsibility grows teeth when things go wrong. Responsibility whispers again and again that you must be stronger than your fear, even when strength begins to feel like a lie you keep repeating. And as the docks stretch ahead, I feel the old ache of cool Tiras in my chest, because harbors always feel like home, even when they are enemy stone beneath your boots. And then, inevitably, there came a moment when the story turned toward me, and I became the storm everyone expected. You may have heard songs about me, or rumors, or accusations, and you may have wondered which version is true. The truth is that I am all of them in different moments, because trauma does not make you one consistent person. Trauma makes you a collection of reactions stitched together by duty. When I fought at the end of that night, I drew on cold, on wind, on the sea's cruel memory. Ice is a convenient metaphor for control because it looks still even when it is killing you underneath. I used ice because I wanted to stop the world from moving long enough for my people to escape. I used ice because I was afraid, and fear makes you reach for whatever power you can hold. People think power feels like certainty. Power often feels like a shaking hand trying not to drop a blade. I have known rage that felt like fire in my throat, and grief that felt like water in my lungs, and on that night, I tried to turn both into something useful. That is the temptation of magic, and also the tragedy of it, because magic lets you believe you can shape consequence the way you shape frost. But consequence is not frost. Consequence does not melt when you decide you have had enough. As the wind rises in my memory, I feel again the way salt spray can sting the skin like tiny needles, and how quickly that sting becomes numbness when cold takes over. I remember the groaning sound of ice forming because it is not silent. It cracks like strained wood, and it sighs like an exhausted sailor, and it tells you that nature itself is being forced into a new shape. When you hear that sound in your imagination, let your character pause briefly, because a pause makes the listener lean closer. In that pause, I want to confess something that leaders rarely confess. I was afraid that if I stopped, I would have to feel everything I had done. So I kept moving, and I kept fighting, and I kept telling myself that stopping would be weakness. Sometimes stopping is the only way to remain human. Sometimes you must stop to remember that your enemy also has a heartbeat. I did not remember enough. If you walk slowly along the dock's length, let the waves be audible, because waves are the lullaby that contrasts with my storm. In the storm, I was not thinking about being legendary. I was thinking about the faces of sailors who trusted me, and the weight of their trust felt heavier than any spell. Trust is the most dangerous thing people give their leaders, because it becomes a weapon in the leader's hands. I did not want to be a weapon. I wanted to be a protector. But protection and destruction can look identical when you are on the wrong side of the blast. I remember the moment the fighting finally began to feel distant, not because it was over, but because distance itself became our only mercy. Distance is an ugly mercy, but it is still mercy. As the ships pull away in my mind, I feel the old, familiar exhaustion settle into my bones, the exhaustion of being responsible for choices no one else wants to claim. The sea continues, indifferent and patient, washing against the docks as if it has all the time in the world. And I envy it because the sea does not have to explain itself. If you end your walk by looking once more up toward the pyramid, do it slowly. That slow upward look feels like a prayer, even if the prayer is only the wish that we could have chosen differently. I cannot change what happened in Dazar'alor, and I cannot undo the bargains and the burning ships and the grief we left behind. I can only tell the story in a softer voice than the cannons used, because a softer voice might reach someone's heart before hatred does. And as your footsteps fade into the harbor's ambiance, I let my voice fade too, like a storm moving farther out over open water until only the waves remain.
Commander! Look!
Fish jumping right into our nets. Go! Go!
Those ballista will be firing any second.
Continue our approach, Captain.
Aye, Lord Admiral.
Lady Proudmoore, the mission was a success. Our stealth agents are clear of the area.
Thank you, Spy Master. Hi, Tinker. Are you ready?
I'll activate our surprise just as soon as we're in range.
Now.
Steady.
Incoming!
Hi, Tinker! Calvin. No.
Look out!
Does the mighty Rastakan need old Samdi's help yet again?
Aid us, or you will be the lower of a ruined kingdom with no one to remember your name.
Rise, fallen one. Zandalar, be ours forever.
Princess Talanji!
Get to the king. Now.
Father, no. Please, stay. Stay with me.
Talanji, my daughter. I'm so sorry.
Hush, Father. Shh. It's all right.
Forgive me.
One someday.
Yes, my queen.
What have you done to me?
Oh, he didn't tell you about our bargain? Shame on him.
Your Majesty! The Alliance dogs are escaping! What are your orders? After them!